Christmas during times of war. Back in 1914, on Christmas Eve, a spontaneous ceasefire was observed across the whole of the Western Front. The Christmas truce of the First World War was an extraordinary event in the history of warfare. Initially, it received widespread media coverage in the New York Times on the 31st of December 1914, followed by British newspapers like The Mirror, the Illustrated London News, The Times, the Daily Mail, printed front-page pictures of British and German troops mingling and singing Christmas carols. And here's some of the news headlines. Christmas truce at the front. Snowballs and jokes with the foe. And friendly chinwag with the Germans. And can any of you chaps mend a gramophone? And these are some of the subtitles in there. Historic group, British and German troops photographed together. The London Illustrated News, and it actually, the original title was The Light of Peace in the Trenches on Christmas Eve. A German soldier opens the spontaneous truce by approaching British lines with a small Christmas tree. This was actually printed in 1914, and in this case, January the 9th of 1915. And this was widely published at that time, French, British, German, and then the French government was the first to severely censor any reports of what they called fraternization with the enemy. When I went to the Imperial War Museum in 1914, I was invited to England in July and August 1914 on the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War. So 2014 I was up there, and I particularly wanted to see the Imperial War Museum. Now, it's interesting because for most of the last century, historians and governments have denied the Christmas truce even occurred. Now, I've been hearing about the Christmas truce since I was a little boy, because I met people who'd been there and talking to us about it in Rhodesia and so on, soldiers, veterans. And I kept hearing about the Christmas truce, but the history books either were silent or denied it happened. It's a myth, it's a legend. Well, imagine my surprise when I saw the whole ground floor of the Imperial War Museum had First World War exhibits, as you'd expect, on the centenary, but they had a massive exhibit just on the Christmas truce. The Christmas truce is now openly acknowledged at the Imperial War Museum in London with photographs of German and British troops celebrating Christmas today. Men of the London Rifle Brigade fraternized with German soldiers Christmas Day 1914. These are pictures I took of the Imperial War Museum messages. By the end of 1914, the exhausted armies had sought safety in trenches. In the opposing front lines, men endured the same wretched conditions, often within earshot of one another. At Christmas Eve, German and British soldiers emerged to meet in a frozen strip of mud between the trenches. They sang carols, exchanged presents, from cigarettes and cigars to buttons and badges. And interesting that what was fake news, and you can get deplatformed by whatever they had that back then, suddenly after a while they admit, no, it actually did happen. And this is also in the British War Museum. Hate propaganda against the wicked Hun began as soon as Britain went to war. The press was full of tales of German atrocities, both real and imagined. In this poisonous atmosphere, angry crowds smashed windows of shops owned by Germans. British authorities interned German men in camps. It was, according to a poem by Rudyard Kipling, the most popular British writer at the time, when the English learned to hate. Sadly, it wasn't just in England. Cape Town, there were mobs that attacked German butcheries, bakeries, broke their windows, burned the shops out, beat the people up. The savagery of normally civilized people against their neighbors because of the war propaganda was shocking. Still, the British War Museum. Reports of German atrocities were often lurid and false. Well, I can virtually say always, actually. They include stories of mutilated nuns, butchered babies, but people were all too ready to believe them. In Britain, there was a cleansing of all things German, or German-sounding. London's Coburg Hotel was renamed the Connaught. German Shepherd dogs became Alsatians. German easels became Belgian thrush. Orchestras stopped playing Beethoven and Wagner. Political pressure was brought to bear to censor all reports of the event from mainstream history books for decades. I mean, as somebody who loves history and reads a lot of history books, it was funny. I heard people talking about the Christmas truce, but I never read a word about it for years. It's only in the last 15, 20 years that the stories really started to come out. For years, this extraordinary event was known only by word of mouth from participants. The damage caused by the Christmas truce to propaganda campaigns to demonize the enemy was regarded as a serious threat to the war. It's taken decades to unearth the details of the fascinating events surrounding Christmas 1914. And here's about a man who discovered his grandfather's diaries writing about time. So, you can imagine you've got the generation that endured the war just wants to forget about it. Next generation is probably not so interested, but the grandchildren are more interested. And I suppose that's where I come in, because my parents went through the Second World War, my grandparents went through the First World War. And I've been digging out things too, and it's extraordinary to find. And the stories about this, so it started to come out basically from looking in the attic, reading through granddad's and grandma's letters, and suddenly unearthing phenomenally interesting stories. And suddenly the press was filled, especially as we're approaching 2014, the 100th anniversary of the First War. Suddenly there was a resurgence of interest, and all these intriguing things. I remember people looking at me skew and denying and saying this is ridiculous when I spoke about the Christmas truce, because it just didn't make sense. And if it was true, why would we not have seen a Hollywood movie on it and things like that? Well, the Christmas miracles came out, and it was remarkable as the grandsons dug out things from the attic, and granddaughters. And so books started to come out on the Christmas truce, and Silent Night, a moving tale of horror taking a holiday. It's a good subtitle. In the first 5 months of the Great War, they didn't call it the First World War, they didn't know there was going to be a second, and they thought it was the war to end all wars, so at the time they called it the Great War. Over 1 million Europeans had died in just 5 months of action, killed in action. Most by artillery fire, like 85% of casualties were artillery fire. The initially fast-moving campaigns had degenerated into trench warfare, static warfare, with a continuous front line of barbed wire and trenches stretching from the North Sea, from Belgium and Dutch border all the way down to the Swiss frontier. Emily Hobhouse was the most prominent campaign against British involvement in the First World War. It was this famous Englishwoman, Emily Hobhouse, who had exposed to the world the horrors of Lord Kitchener's scorched earth campaign against the Boer republics of the Transvaal and Orange Free State, and the horrors of the British concentration camps in South Africa. And just some of these sketches give you a bit of a feel. The burning of 30,000 farms and farmhouses. And the British actually photographed it, documented a lot of their burning of farmhouses and dynamiting of wells, and in some cases blowing up the foundations even, so it would be even harder to build up the homes. And here's a case in point showing the demolitions of not just buildings and farms, but churches. Here's the interior of the ruined Dutch Reformed church in Ventersburg, burned by British forces, night of 2nd of February 1902. 1902, I mean, this is quite far into the war. There's no conventional war going on. Why target churches? British column burnt down the church in Lindley, and the Novelsport concentration camp. Try and spot the trees or the shade. And this, by the way, Free State can be the coldest in the country in winter, and it was bad. The grim, now I'm reading from Emily Hobhouse's, these are her captions of these photographs. The grim plight of those held at the Bloemfontein concentration camp. Children at the Bloemfontein concentration camp carrying water. So this is what Emily Hobhouse wrote next to these pictures. Anna de Waal and her daughter performed domestic chores outside their tent. Orphans at Novelsport concentration camp. Orphans, the innocent casualties of war. The body of Miss Boertje of Ladybrunt, 18 years old when she died in Bloemfontein concentration camp. It was a wish that the Vierkleur be draped around her chest after death. That's the Transvaal flag. Gijsbert Johannes Vermeulen of De Wetsdorp died at age 12 in Bloemfontein concentration camp. These are all Emily Hobhouse's pictures. Bloemfontein concentration camp, Lizzie van Zyl holding a porcelain doll given to her by Emily Hobhouse. The body of Jaapie van den Berg outside the tent where he died, Bloemfontein concentration camp. And so these are some of her letters, and there have been many books written about it, especially on the centenary, 2002, 2002, quite a lot came out. Interesting, Lord Kitchener said these camps were refugee camps to house people for their protection. And yet, as Emily Hobhouse documented, why do they have signs like notice to the prisoners of war in 2 languages? No prisoners of war allowed outside the limits of the camp. Sentries are under strict orders to shoot any prisoners passing in a fence by order. These are refugee camps for the protection of these people who are homeless. Why are they homeless? Did they come here of their own accord? Are they free to leave? Well, yes, I mean, those are good questions to ask. This is a painting by Emily Hobhouse of a church burned down, a farm burned down, a cemetery. And these are needle stitchings of, which is based on sketches from her of a family leaving the home that's been destroyed, and the hideous concentration camp conditions in these bell tents, which gives no insulation in winter. And a few old men and a lot of women and many children in these camps dying at the rate of 250 per thousand per year. That means a quarter died every year. That means in 4 years, no one would be alive, statistically. That's worse odds than you can have of any camps of any sort on any side in the Second World War. A quarter of the total population die every year. This was, of course, deliberate policy. Lord Kitchener wanted to starve the families of the Boer commanders, deliberately starve them to death, and soap was considered luxury. They weren't given any hygiene because the goal was to kill them off as fast as possible so that the commanders would be brought to the negotiation table and surrender and end the war quicker. There's an interesting film out, That English Woman, on Emily Hobhouse, well worth seeing. So in 1914, Emily Hobhouse authored the open Christmas letter calling for peace. 101 British women signed Emily's open Christmas letter, which was endorsed by 155 prominent German and Austrian women in response. Under the heading, On Earth Peace, Goodwill Towards Men, Emily Hobhouse wrote, Sisters, the Christmas message sounds like mockery to a world at war, but those of us who wished and still wish for peace may surely offer a solemn greeting to such of you who feel as we do. She mentioned that as in South Africa during the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902, the brunt of modern war falls upon non-combatants, and the conscience of the world cannot bear the sight. If you go to Bloemfontein, to the Women's Monument in the Anglo-Boer War Museum, they've got a wall with the names of the 5,600 Boer men who died in the Anglo-Boer War. Killed in action, dates, or died of disease, or died of wounds. 5,600. Facing it is a wall with 32,000 names of the women and children who died. What kind of war, with dates, names, places, what kind of war kills 5 times more women and children than the men in combat? And that, unfortunately, was the introduction to the 20th century. That's the way war's gone. No longer are wars directed between armies, but now wars are directed against civilians. And it's just, what a shocking introduction to the Second World War, to the 20th century. And by the way, at the beginning of the 20th century, Britain was the most despised nation on earth, and the Boers were the most respected, honored, and loved people on the planet. Amazing how the press can change things in just a couple of generations, isn't it? And so this is Emily Hobhouse's letter. And the people who signed it, some very prominent ladies and leaders in Britain signed this, including Emily Pankhurst, interestingly. You can spot her over there, who's pretty famous as well. Is it not our mission to preserve life? Do not humanity and common sense alike prompt us to join hands with the women and urge our rulers to stave off further bloodshed? May Christmas hasten the day. The German mothers responded to our English sisters, sisters of the same race, our warm and heartfelt thanks for Christmas greetings. Women of the belligerent countries, with all faithfulness, devotion and love for their country, can go beyond it and maintain true solidarity with the women of other belligerent nations that really civilized women never lose their humanity. Emily Hobhouse also oversaw the raising of a large amount of funds and shipping of food and medicines through neutral countries to the women and children of Austria, and Germany, who were suffering as a result of the British naval blockade. And by the way, these dark and blue areas are the sea mines that the Royal Navy sowed to limit the freedom of vessels to get in and out of Germany so they could more easily monitor. And unlike previous blockades, which blockaded military-related munitions and so on, this was a total starvation blockade. Even food was blockaded. That was rare. That was going beyond what the Geneva and Hague Conventions permitted. In the Imperial War Museum in London, I saw this picture of starving children in Vienna, Austria as a result of the hunger blockade. This would have been denied. This would have got you fired, if not shot, publishing this back in 1914 to 1918. But through Emily Hobhouse's efforts, thousands of women and children starving in Germany and Austria because of the British naval blockade were fed by the support she is able to channel to them. She wrote the book To Love One's Enemies. So, numerous ministers, taking their cue from her, proclaimed from the pulpit that the guns may fall silent at least upon the night when angels sang. Now, though these messages were officially rebuffed and suppressed in the heavily censored media, many of the soldiers in the front lines seemed to share these sentiments. From the first week of December, informal truces were observed by soldiers across the front line, and it was bigger than anyone could have ever imagined. The more this is coming out. In a letter dated 7 December 1914, Charles de Gaulle expressed his dismay at fraternization with the enemy, where French and German troops exchanged newspapers, recovered their dead, and organized burial parties in no man's land. This is 7th of December already. Christmas cheer is starting early. French General de Urbel expressed alarm over soldiers staying too long in the same sector, becoming friendly with enemies. Because sometimes they were only 50 meters from the enemy trenches, and they'd be shouting conversations back and forth, and to the extent they were conducting conversations between the lines and even visiting one another's trenches. After heavy rains near Ypres, where the Germans held the high ground, the British held the low ground, the English troops came out of their trenches when they were flooded, literally flooded. I mean, if they stayed in there, they would drown. They came out of the trenches in full view of the Germans, who expressed their sympathy and did not open fire on their soaked and vulnerable enemy. The 2nd Essex Regiment recorded on the 11th of December in their war diary that their officers' men met the German Saxon Corps halfway between trenches, exchanged food, cigarettes, chocolates, and conversations. The Germans said that the British had better cigarettes, and the British said the Germans had much better chocolates. And there was a real build-up towards Christmas because on all sides, the governments had promised the soldiers will be home for Christmas. The war will be over by Christmas. Yeah, how many politicians have promised that? So, King George V of England got this card printed and delivered to all the British soldiers and saw that they got plum puddings and things like that. And the Kaiser ensured that there were enough Christmas trees for every 2 meters along the entire front line. Yeah. Unbelievable. Yes, every two. I forget how many thousands of railway carriages were needed to transport these Christmas trees. And there was all sorts of extraordinary things done by both sides to try and bolster the morale on, because they weren't going to be home for Christmas. The Christmas truce began in the region of Ypres, in Belgium, where the Germans were enthusiastically singing Christmas carols in their trenches. And when the British soldiers joined in the singing of Silent Night, and then responded with carols of their own, the two sides began shouting Christmas greetings to one another. And here's one of the reports. They finished their carol. We thought we ought to retaliate in some way, so we sang the first Noel. When that finished, they all began clapping. Then they struck up a favorite of theirs, O Tauernbaum, Christmas tree. And so it went on. First the Germans would sing one of their carols, and we'd sing one of ours. And when we start up, O Come All You Faithful, the Germans immediately joined and sing the same hymn to the Latin words, Adeste Fidelis. And I thought, well, this is really most extraordinary. Two nations both sing the same carol in the middle of a war. Shortly after that, the soldiers spontaneously came out of their trenches, walked across no man's land to greet one another, exchanging gifts and souvenirs, as the Illustrated London News depicts. The truce rapidly spread across the Western Front, with over 100,000 German and British troops alone, not even counting the French and Canadians and others, in this unofficial cessation of fighting. I mean, has this ever been seen in history before on this scale? And here's Xmas 1914, a friendly chat with the enemy. This is one granddad's card that was found in an attic. And by the way, it's pretty confusing when you look at some of these pictures, because you'll have German soldiers wearing British hats and British soldiers wearing German hats, and they're so intermingled and they're swapping one another's hats. It got pretty confusing. Soon Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, Belgian, French troops joined in the Christmas celebrations on the frozen strip of no man's land. They said it was an extraordinary day. It was so crisp, it was so cold, that the normal stench of everything from chlorine and lime and all of that, and of dead body, there was none that smelled. The freeze had completely sealed that. There was no horrible smells. It was a beautiful, bracing air. It was a lovely day. It was crystal clear. It was like a perfect day. There was not a cloud. There was not rain. There was no snow. It was just, and the ground was now hard. The mud had frozen so that they could walk across it without slipping and sliding and falling into the mud. It was like the whole thing was designed for this. There were joint worship services held. They were singing carols together. Respectful burial services were conducted by the combatants for the dead between the lines, with complete intermixing, French, German, British, all together. Now, they didn't have these metal markers, but these are people who would have been buried at that time, and later family members came and brought. This person died on the 10th of November 1914, but was only buried on Christmas Day. Soldiers swapped ration packs, wine, pies. The British made good pies, the Germans made great chocolates. Souvenirs like buttons, badges, and hats. The French wines were in good demand, and so there was this intermingling amongst them. 2 encounters, friendly and otherwise, incidents in the French fighting line. And so these French soldiers come along with spades to do burial service, and they're saluting and shaking of hands, and they cooperated together with the burial parties. Foes in the trenches swapped pies for wine. British and Germans exchanged gifts during Christmas truce on firing line. Pass season's compliments. English and Saxon officers photographed together between the hostile trenches. So this was December the 31st, 1914. The graphic, again, depicting this is published in January 1915. Pictorial proof of the Christmas Day truce. Now, these pictures disappeared super fast after that. So, there was just this burst of, and then gone. But some people had these hidden in the attics, which have surfaced more recently. And souvenirs of Christmas Day, all the different, they really like these spiked helmets and so on as souvenirs, and so there's lots of swapping of things. The next day, football matches were played between the lines. British officer Robert Graves wrote of the football match between the 133rd Saxon Regiment and the Scottish troops. And there's all sorts of football matches. In fact, that was a major one. The Germans won that one 3-2. The Glasgow News, 2nd of February, reported the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders won their match 4-1. And the Royal Field Artillery Lieutenant Albert Wynne wrote of their soccer match against the Hanoverians near Ypres on Christmas Day. The British even brought out a crown, one crown, with in 2014, with the poppy and the different helmets and the rifles together, and then playing football together. Commanders threatened repercussions for lack of discipline. Numerous officers ordered the artillery to open fire on fraternizing troops in no man's land. On none of these occasions did the artillery obey the orders. They were told to open fire on their troops, and the enemy troops mingled in no man's land. And that was just too much. The artillerymen uniformly said, "No, sir, we cannot do that." There are numerous complaints on record by officers shocked at the total breakdown of discipline, as they called it, as men point-blank refused orders to open fire on their own soldiers mingling with the enemy in no man's land on Christmas Day. General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien commanded this British Second Corps. Now, Horace Smith-Dorrien is a famous figure in South African history. He's one of the extremely few British survivors of the Battle of Isandlwana during the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, when the Zulus annihilated an entire British regiment. General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien issued orders forbidding fraternizing with the enemy and complained that his orders were disregarded by his soldiers. Richard Sherman was so impressed by the camaraderie experienced between his German regiment and the French troops during the Christmas truce, even exchanging addresses with one another, so he went on to found the Youth Hostel Association, in 1919 to provide meeting places where young men of all countries could get to know one another. And it was super successful. Now, you might think this only happened on the Western Front, and that's what I assumed. But in fact, it was generally observed on the Eastern Front for longer. And the difference is, on the Western Front, the officers forbade it, but the troops did it. It was spontaneous from the ground. On the Eastern Front, the Russian, Austrian, and German commanders ordered no hostile actions, do not fire unless fired upon, during the period of Christmas, from the 24th of December till the 6th of January, inclusive. Because the Russians observe not just the 12 days of Christmas, but the 6th of January as their Christmas day. So in the Eastern Front, the commanders ordered no hostile actions. And this was observed throughout the entire Russian lines, all the German Austrian lines, with the exception of the Serbian front. The Serbs did not observe it. They fought throughout, so the Austrians were forced to fight back on the Serbian front. But that one was even more incredible. And we've got pictures of German and Russian troops dancing, singing together, Austro-Hungarian, Russian commanders, ceasefires for the 2 weeks of Christmas. And here's actually Russian and Austrian troops happily celebrating Christmas together on the ice. Numerous French and British officers were court-martialed for participating in this fraternization with the enemy, as they called it. Whole units had to be pulled back from the front and sent to other fronts when they displayed reluctance to fire on the enemy whom they celebrated Christmas with. The British had to pull some units out and send them to Iraq and fight the Ottoman Turks because they were absolutely useless. The Germans pulled massive whole units and just shipped them to Eastern Front because they found they're now firing how they're not interested in fighting the people that they celebrate Christmas with. Numerous artillery units began to fire only at precise locations at prearranged times to avoid causing casualties. They'd send messages over saying, we are commanded to fire between these and these hours on this area. Please make sure you're not in that area. There was even times when they'd come over and say, your trench is about to be bombarded, come and seek shelter in our trenches. And then when a counterattack, the French would be going over and seeking shelter in the German trenches. And there was such a camaraderie. And the men would know the people on the other side. So the officers reported of soldiers firing high and ineffectually, deliberately missing, just doing their duty by firing when they're told to fire, but not aiming at the enemy anymore. Now, an Easter Sunday truce was also attempted by German units in 1915, but they were suppressed by British artillery fire. In November 1915, a Saxon unit briefly fraternized with the Liverpool Battalion and conducted burial services together. In December 1915, there were explicit orders directed by Allied commanders and elaborate procedures made to forestall any repeat of the previous Christmas truce. So they organized non-stop artillery barrages from Christmas Eve all the way through Christmas Day. But even the multiple artillery barrages ordered across the entire front line throughout Christmas Day by the British were not completely effective, and a number of truces were observed in the Western Front Christmas 1915. Evidence of that? They were wearing helmets in 1915, they were not wearing helmets in 1914. On some sections of the Western Front, carols and gifts were exchanged between German and British troops. At least one football match with 50 soldiers aside was recorded in 1915. That must have been quite a football match. And there's pictures of the sides joining together again. Sir Ian Calhoun of the Scotch Guards was court-martialed for defying orders by maintaining a short truce to bury the dead between the lines on Christmas Day 1915. Now, he was court-martialed, he should have been shot, but because he is related to the British Prime Minister H.H.S. Asquith, his punishment was commuted. He still got hard labour and all that. German attempts to observe Christmas truces in December 1916 and 1917 were rebuffed by British artillery barrages. But recent evidence has come to light of a successful Christmas truce in 1916 between the German and Canadian soldiers near Vimy Ridge, which is a famous name to any Canadian, where they exchanged Christmas presents and greetings. The Canadians and Germans visited one another's lines on 25 December 1916. Now, Vimy Ridge was some of the most viciously contested terrain. Those were some serious battles. And yet they came together, embraced as friends on Christmas Day and Christmas Eve. And here's a card, again dug out of somebody's attic from some grandfather's, report which was sent back to, it was actually his grandmother, and seeing the stories of both sides stopped firing on Christmas Day. This is, by the way, what the front lines look like now. If you go to places in Flanders and Ypres, the mounds, all caused by the upheavals of the bombardments, the mortars, the artillery, just absolutely stunning. Now, numerous famous authors that you'd recognize, like C.S. Lewis of the Narnia series, fought on the Western Front. And J.R.R. Tolkien was born in Bloemfontein, who wrote Lord of the Rings. He also fought on the Western Front. And A.A. Milne, creator of Winnie the Pooh, fought on the Western Front. And obviously, it influenced them in very different ways. A Christmas truce memorial unlaid in Frelinghuysen in France on 11th of November 2008 on a spot where 25 December 1914 the Royal Welsh Fusiliers played football with the German 371 Battalion, which the Germans won 2-1. And here's newspaper reports. This is all around 2014, particularly as an absolute outpouring of interest in these events, and they had memorials and recreations and reenactors and military tours. I even joined a 2014 centenary tour of the battlefields in Ypres, and our very good friend there who runs Frontline Tours gave me first-hand. It was remarkable to go to all these places. And here's one of them. This is one of the places where the Australians and the Germans met. And here, 86 years later, the Khaki Chums Christmas truce brought footballs, Christmas trees, wreaths, and there's the little Australian flags. 1914, 1999. 85 years, lest we forget. And while I was there, who should turn up? But Felix, or at least Felix's great-great-great-great-grandchild. If you've seen the film Joyeux Noel, there's Felix who comes in, one of the cats who went between the lines. And dead serious, it's not a joke. You may think it's a joke when it came up in that film, but the French general ordered the cat to be executed for treason, because this French cat went back and forth between the German and the French lines. And fortunately, the soldiers couldn't find or catch the cat, but the order actually went out: execute the cat for treason. I mean, that's the kind of people you had running that war. Now, you can immediately tell which were the British trenches and which were the German trenches. These are British trenches. Why? Right angles and corrugated iron and so on. But the British had these straight line ones. Why did they keep changing lines? You don't want a mortar shell to land in the trench and go the whole way along. So you limit the casualties by these sharp angles. But you can spot the German trenches. The German trenches were always curved. They found that was more efficient. And the other thing is, I don't know if you can see, they've got these duck boards. They had a better drainage system, much better drainage system. In fact, the Germans tend to build much better trenches, and it was a philosophy. The Germans they'd taken the war as far as they needed to. Now they were holding the line, and so they dug concrete pillars. The British wouldn't allow their men to build good trenches because this is temporary. We're going to have the breakthrough, and the cavalry's going to charge through the open ground, and which of course is nonsense. Pie in the sky, hope, pipe dream. But nevertheless, the British and French didn't allow their men to build proper, decent trenches with concrete bunkers and all the rest, because this is temporary. We're not going to be here long. Next week we're going to take we'll be charging all the way along. And of course, it never happened. And so that's also a difference between the quality of the lines. This is the German war cemetery, Langemark, in Belgium. And when I went to Ypres, I counted 65 Hammonds on the walls, just in Ypres. And by the way, when you count names on the walls, that means they couldn't find the body. There's no grave. And so, artillery. So I went to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and they informed me 480 Hammonds were killed on the British side in the First World War. Well, then I went across the line to Langemark, where the Germans were, and I found 11 Lindemanns, my mother's family names, on those sides. So, it just makes you wonder, why on earth were our ancestors fighting one another on this occasion? Isaiah 43 verse 1, I have called you by name, you are mine. Scriptures on both sides. All gave some gave all. And of course, the holiest day in the British calendar is 11th of November. And remembering the war dead, which is why Rhodesia chose 11th of November to declare independence, to just make a point to the British. We fought for you more than once, and you stabbing us in the back. Well, here's one of the war memorials, and you can see the intermingling of the different units. And of course, they've got the football, because regularly when the units meet at these battlefronts, you'll actually have the actual units that were there at the time of the war, and they'll play soccer matches with one another close to the fields, which is just wonderful, because now the Germans and the British are allies, and they will fight shoulder to shoulder together. And there's some great monuments that start to be made, like always the football in the middle. That's such a fun depiction. The 2005 French film Joyeux Noël dramatizes the Christmas truce in 1914 through the eyes of the French, the Scottish, and German soldiers in the Western Front. How many have seen Joyeux Noël? I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it. And how would you pronounce Joyeux Noël correctly?
Joyeux. Joie.
Joie?
Joyeux.
No. Say again?
Joyeux.
I knew that I was doing it wrong. It's like the Champs d'Elysees, which my wife said is Champs-Élysées. But it's spelled Champs d'Elysees. No, but it's Champs-Élysées. Okay. So I know the French have got a different way of pronouncing it. Say Joyeux Noël again.
Joyeux.
I just find it very hard to pronounce it like the French do. Well, I learned how to do Champs-Élysées, but this is a good film. It's very well made. I've only got one complaint. How on earth is the Scottish chaplain Catholic? Where did they find a Roman Catholic chaplain in Scotland from? I don't know. I mean, a country that's like 98% Presbyterian at that moment. But they had I suppose they liked the Latin and the in Domine. So all that Catholic stuff. But aside from that, it was a very good film. And how many have seen the Sainsbury's 2014 ad of the Christmas truce? Oh, you've got to get this, the Sainsbury's Christmas ad of 2014. Absolutely the best advert ever. And so well done. And just a tribute to the soldiers on both sides of the Christmas truce. Sainsbury's is a British department store, I think. But anyway, it was just brilliantly done. And they had the help of the British Legion and others in recreating. And these were people who knew what they were doing. They got everything perfect down to the smallest details. And here you can see later in the war, 3 concerned Germans helping some poor Frenchmen out of the mud in Verdun. Verdun was one of the worst battles of the First World War from the French perspective in particular. And it was a horrible, pointless battle where both sides were just pouring in men. It started with a clever concept from the German side to make an attack on Verdun, which the French counted so important that they would have to commit more and more forces. And it was to degrade the French forces by putting a threat on what they would risk anything to defend. And Verdun was of historic significance because where they were defeated in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. So it was so from the German perspective, it started out clever. We're going to really inflict huge casualties on the enemy because for pride and history and strategic reasons, they will be committed. But then somebody decided to just forget the whole purpose of it, and the German side started to react with the same attitude of, instead of just inflicting loss on the enemy, they started to order the men to try and take the positions, which only caused massive casualties on both sides. So in the end, the Germans almost lost as many troops as the French did in what started out as a trap for the French. And it just shows how a good plan can degenerate so quickly in the hands of some bureaucrats above. And do you know, since then, the French and the German veterans of Verdun would meet together every year, and they would weep together. I mean, there's the absolute camaraderie of the people who fought. In fact, well, I'll get there in a moment about my father, but this is why we have the poppies, because the poppies remind us of where the fields where hundreds of thousands of British troops and about 1 million Frenchmen died, and the poppies grow there. And in my training, I don't know if they said it to you, Anthony, but many times I'd hear our sergeant major saying, if you don't do this, you'll be pushing up poppies. And so pushing up poppies, it means, if you don't do this, you'll get killed. So that was pushing up poppies became a euphemism in the army for getting killed. And so if I didn't want to push up poppies, I had to listen to this and do that. But that's why we remember not just the men, but remember there's a lot of war dogs and a lot of horses involved in the war. It's tragic how many died in this hideous conflict. And so the poppies have become probably the most easily identifiable symbol to remember the sacrifices made by courageous, duty-orientated people in that generation. And you can see the wreaths of poppies and the displays on these. This is particularly 2014 anniversary. I went to the Tower of London, August 2014, and I saw the beginnings of this incredible artistic display. This is one of the most extraordinary memorials ever. It was a living, evolving display consisting of 888,000 ceramic poppies. Now, the British worked this out well. It represented all the soldiers who died on the British and Commonwealth Empire side in 1914-1918 war. And they'd get people to sponsor at £10 a poppy, ceramic poppy. And afterwards they could come and collect it after 11th of November and bring it home. So it was a memento. But so it was a self-financing operation with proceeds going beyond the cost of this to veterans. And it was every day they would be planting a whole lot more, and they were getting volunteers to plant them, often relatives of the names. And each night they would read the names of people. And it started on the 4th of August, because that's when Britain declared war, until 11th of November, which is the date of the armistice. So people gathered, and this was called Blood-Swept Lands and Seas of Red. And some is in the air, because of course there was quite a lot who died in the First Air War, and representative of every force and fleets of arms. And the people gathered every night. And, I don't know what others were thinking, but when I saw this, I just saw red. Because I have all the respect in the world for the men who did their duty, as they saw it. But the politicians who sent them there, and for what? And what on earth did they achieve, ultimately? The men on the ground gave all, in many cases. But the politicians who sent them there, what was this all for? Why were they involved in this? So the names would be read. I mean, this was very moving, just reading out the names in the units. And this was a good memorial. Well, this brings me to my father, who was all 6 years, Second World War, in the Royal Artillery as a bombardier, operating 25-pounders. And my dad did not talk about the war much. In fact, that's one thing you find. People who went through the war, they did not say much about it. But every now and then I'd get a little inkling. Like one thing my dad mentioned was, do you know, Field Marshal Montgomery had a picture of Erwin Rommel on his nightstand in his tent. What? Why would he do that? He just mentioned it. It's something you don't forget. Well, in 2014, when I went to the Imperial War Museum, what did I see? Well, on the first floor, it's all First War, but second floor, it was Second World War. And there was a recreation of Bernard Montgomery's tent, and lo and behold, on the side table next to his bed, stretcher, was not a picture of his wife, a picture of Erwin Rommel. Like confirmation at the Imperial War Museum of an odd remark my dad made. It's like people saying that, by the bedside table of General Patton, he had tank attacks and infantry attacks by Erwin Rommel. And it was bedside reading. He'd read Rommel. And the logic of it was, he's the gold standard. And we want to understand, we want to get in the mind of enemies. So as Patton said, I read your book. And, if you want to get in the mind of the person on the other side, you read his book. And interesting. But my dad would often say, it wasn't like that. And he didn't believe that. And I'd ask, what, Dad? And he'd say, any of it. And he'd say things like rubbish. What's rubbish? This whole film, it wasn't like that. American propaganda. And he'd point out that, he said, Germans were honourable gentlemen. There was no atrocities in North Africa. Africa Korps were gentlemen. And, we cared for one another's wounded. And then he came out with, we sang Christmas carols to one another. 1941, 1942 in the North African desert. And we swapped ration packs and showed pictures of our families and played soccer. Now, I'd heard about the Christmas truce in the First World War. I've never read anywhere about the Christmas truce in North African desert in the Second World War. But my dad spoke about it. Strange. And here's in Italy too. So, strange things. Now, my mother's father, my grandfather on the maternal side, was in Africa Korps. So he was on Rommel's side. So, I remember hearing that my grandfather was coming to visit. Now, my brother and I were a bit nervous because we'd heard Dad and Granddad had fought one another in the Second World War. So we were imagining there's going to be a war in the living room. In summer there's going to be some. But in fact, nothing like that. And these are sort of pictures that sort of ruined the demonization of the enemy kind of pictures. When you see what was going on in the Eastern Front and the people in Russia and Ukraine, Latvia and Lithuania welcoming the liberating German forces. And interesting because right now you've got the map in Eastern Europe looks more like Brest-Litovsk Treaty of 1918, which Germany made with Russia, which had a free and independent Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, Belarus, all the way through. And you think, well, that's interesting. Georgia, Armenia, and so on. Because the Versailles Treaty reversed all that, betrayed all these countries like Ukraine back under the Soviet Union. And, we were the good guys, and this was a great peace. And now the map of Europe has moved back to what Germany made it back in the First World War, where they liberated these countries. And these are people welcoming the German forces, saving them from the Soviets and the communists. So here's my dad with my mom, and often wondered why on earth were my parents on opposite sides in the war. So here's my granddad coming to visit us, and that's me and my brother. And my dad and granddad embraced as friends, and we sat there astounded. Small as I was, I can still remember, they loved one another. They respected one another. There was this camaraderie, a camaraderie I never saw my dad express towards anyone else in my life. I never saw him more open and emotional and showing respect for anyone in my whole life than he did for my granddad. How do you explain that sort of thing? Absolutely bizarre. Well, here's another Christmas story. How many have read the book A Higher Call? This is really extraordinary. One of the most amazing books I've read a couple of times actually now. So 20th of December 1943, there's an American bombing unit, B-17s, going to bomb Bremen. And they get shot up pretty badly by Focke-Wulf 190s on the way back. And there's this one bomber that is so shot up that it doesn't think it's going to make it. And the pilot glances outside and he freezes, he blinks hard, he looks again, hoping it's just a mirage, but his co-pilots are seeing the same frightening scene. It's a nightmare, he said. He's going to destroy us. The pilot agreed. They were looking at a grey German Messerschmitt Mi-29 fighter cruising just a few feet away from their wingtip. It was 5 days before Christmas 1943, and the fight had closed in the crippled American B-17 bomber for the kill. The B-17 bomber pilot was actually Charlie Brown, 21-year-old farmer from West Virginia. His bomb had been shot up in the skies above Germany after bombing Bremen. Half his crew were wounded. The tail gunner was dead. His blood was frozen over the rear machine guns. And here's the whole B-17 crew, and half of them at that stage were either dead or wounded. But when Brown and his co-pilot Spencer Pinky Luke looked at the fighter pilot, the German did not pull the trigger. He nodded at Brown instead and indicated, "Follow me," and he escorted him out of Germany. And what happened next is one of the most remarkable acts of chivalry. He saluted them, pointed them in the right direction for England, and flew away. Now, years later, Brown would track down his erstwhile enemy for a reunion that reduced both men to tears. His encounter with the German fighter pilot is told in his book, A High Call, one of the most extraordinary war books I've ever read, and I've read a lot. The book explains how that aerial encounter reverberated in both men's lives for more than 50 years. The war left them in turmoil. When they found each other, they found peace. Their story is extraordinary, but it's not unique. British and German troops gathered for post-war reunions, some even vacationed together after both world wars. Do you know that Field Marshal Montgomery's son became best friends with Erwin Rommel's son? Douglas Bader, one of the greatest British fighter pilots of all time, became best friends with the German fighter pilot commander of all, Adolf Garland, who had an incredible over 100 air victories. Now here's Adolf Garland escorting Douglas Bader to prison, but he ensured the Air Force, the Luftwaffe, regularly, after shooting down someone, would, after landing, get in a car, race over to where the pilot was in order to rescue them, because especially bomber pilots might be attacked by the civilians who are being bombed by them, and the army may not treat the Air Force as well. So they wanted to protect their enemy and ensure they came. All Air Force pilots belonged to the Air Force, and they would be put in Air Force camps where they would be treated with better respect. So Adolf Garland felt very strongly about that. In fact, Adolf Garland had Mickey Mouse as his emblem on his fighter plane. And he says, who doesn't like Mickey Mouse? But you can imagine, in Germany, this was considered American degeneracy. What on earth do you have Mickey Mouse on you? But a pilot could choose an emblem to symbolize him, and his signature was Mickey Mouse. But I mean, just look at the amount of enemy victories he's got on his tail. Adolf Garland, I think he shot up at least 109 Allied fighters, all on the Western Front. And here is Adolf Garland and Douglas Bader signing this painting. And here's one of the classic cases where to escape from his plane, when Douglas Bader was shot down, Douglas Bader had lost his legs in a car accident, so he had tin legs. And his legs were trapped. It actually turned out to be a blessing when his plane was shot up, and he could unstrap his legs and parachute without his tin legs. So Adolf Garland organized for the British to fly in replacement legs for him, which they did. Unfortunately, they also bombed a few nearby towns after he organized safe passage for them to bring a repair leg. But anyway, as soon as Douglas Bader got his spare legs, he escaped. And here they are escorting him back after he's been captured. But I mean, again, it was a good spirit, of course you're going to do your best to try and escape. And there was just this camaraderie there. So when I remember reading this book as a teenager, the first and the last, because Adolf Garland fired the first shots and fired some of the last shots of the war from the Air Force side. And who wrote the foreword for this book? Douglas Bader. Douglas Bader and Adolf Garland later in life, best of friends, vacation together, family friends, the whole lot. And there's these documentaries, film documentaries of Adolf Garland, Douglas Bader, great friends. And Adolf Garland was one of the advisors in the Battle of Britain film, which is phenomenal propaganda. You never see a British bomber. You never see a victim of a British bombing. But it's so one-sided. I mean, the music, the whole thing. But you think it's from both sides because technically it's accurate. But I mean, they're just so clever the way they phrase things. And when the British are bombing Berlin to provoke a bombing on London, all you get is a couple of jokes made. You don't actually, you hear the sirens, but you don't see the bombs falling at the results. But you really see the results of the counter bombing. So it's when you look at it as an older person, you think, oh, this film really is serious propaganda. It's made by the same person who's doing James Bond films at the time. Well, the hero behind this story is Franz Steigler. And so Franz Steigler was a fighter ace who had fought in not only the Battle of Britain, but also in North Africa with the Afrika Korps under Rommel, and at the battles over Malta and Sicily. And he had shot up a lot of Allied bombers. And so in that day, just before Christmas 1943, he was refueling his plane when he sees this bomber come so low over, and he must give pursuit. So revenge, not honor, was what was driving Second Lieutenant Franz Steigler to jump into his fighter that chilly December day 1943. Steigler was not just any fighter pilot, he was an ace. One more kill, he'd win the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest award for valor. Yet Steigler was driven by something even deeper than glory. His older brother, August, was a Luftwaffe pilot who had been killed early in the war. American pilots had killed Steigler's comrades who were bombing his country's cities. He had just flown over Germany, seeing the incinerated cities. As 1943, the 1,000 bomber raids, his hometowns being bombed. And so he's out for blood. And here's his brother alongside his night fighter in France, 1940. His brother was flying these sort of planes to get hold of bombers at night, which is very dangerous work. And of course, the 1,000 bomber raids left devastation. So Steigler had already shot down 2 B-17 bombers that day. He's refueling, reloading his guns, standing by his fighter on a German airbase. He hears this bomber's engine, looking up, he sees a B-17 flying so low, it looks like it's going to land. As the bomber disappeared from view behind some trees, Steigler saluted the ground crew, took off in pursuit, and as Steigler's fighter rose to meet the bomber, he maneuvered to attack from behind. He climbed behind the bomber, he squinted in his gun sight, he placed his hand on the trigger. He's about to fire when he hesitated. He was baffled. Nobody in the bomber was firing at him. Now, he'd attacked B-17s before, and B-17s have turrets below, front, back, top. Whichever way you attacked, you were getting 5.0 Brownings coming at you at such it was a very dangerous target to attack a flying fortress. But nobody's firing at him. He looked close to the tail gunner. He was still. His white fleece collar was soaked in blood. He craned his neck to examine the rest of the bomber. Its skin had peeled away by shells. Its guns were knocked out. The men were huddled inside the plane. He could see them tending the wounds of other crewmen. And he continued to nudge his plane alongside the wings. He locked eyes with the pilot, whose eyes were wide with horror and shock. He pressed his hand over the cross that he kept under his flight jacket. He prayed for a moment, eased his index finger off the trigger. He could not shoot. It would be dishonorable to shoot at a crippled enemy aircraft, even if it was a bomber. Steigler was not only motivated by vengeance that day, he lived by a code of honor. He could trace his family's ancestry back to the knights of the 16th century Europe. He had once studied theology. Steigler recalled the voice of his commanding officer in the Africa Corps in the North African Air Force, who once told him, "You follow the rules of war for you, not for your enemy. You fight by the rules to keep your humanity. You never shoot at a pilot in a parachute." He said, "That's like murder. You shoot a pilot in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." And he said, "We're not talking about that the enemy deserves it. You will not keep your humanity if you reduce yourself to that level." So, alone with a crippled bomber, Steigler changed his mission from shooting down enemy bombers to helping this man out back to his own lines. So he nodded at the American pilot and indicated to follow him, and he began flying in formation to the upper right, so that German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground would not shoot down a slow-moving bomber, because it was so slow-moving, it was so low, it would have been easy for the anti-aircraft guns on the North Sea coast to take it down. So he took the position that it's under his escort so that it would get him past the anti-aircraft guns. Steigler escorted the bomber over the North Sea, took one last look at the American pilot, saluted him, peeled his fight away, returned to Germany. "Good luck," Steigler said as they parted. "You are in God's hands." As he watched the German Messerschmitt 109 peel away that December day, Second Lieutenant Charles Brown wasn't thinking of the philosophical connection between enemies. He was thinking of survival. And when he finally reached the English coast and his 2 American corsairs came and escorted him in, he still wondered, will we reach our airbase? He flew back to his base, landed with barely any fuel left. His bomber came to stop, leaned back in his chair, put his hand over the pocket Bible he had in his flight jacket, one of those Gideon Bibles. Then he sat in silence. Now, these are some of the people who survived. Well, here's his commander, Colonel Maurice Preston of the 37th. He strictly forbade Charlie Brown or any of his crew to speak about the incident. It was dangerous for morale. They can't hear about a good member of the enemy and a kind act unto them. This will maybe make their people hesitate. So, strength forbidden. Under no circumstance you don't talk to anyone about this. This is the crew of Brown. and their replacements in 1944. And after their final mission, I think they had to do 24 missions, is it? And then they were sent home. Luftwaffe never had that. They fought and fought and fought just non-stop. They didn't have okay, you can go home after X amount. But anyway, the Americans, after 24 missions, you could go home. And having a bottle of whiskey and a cigar to celebrate. Well, Brown flew more missions before the war ended. He got married, had 2 daughters, supervised foreign aid for the State Department during the Vietnam War, and eventually retired to Florida. But late in life, the encounter with the German pilot began to gnaw at him, and he started having nightmares. But in his dream, he had not experienced mercy. He had awakened just before the bomber crashed. So Brown took on a new mission. He had to find that German pilot. Who was he and why did he save his life? Well, the story about Franz Steigler is absolutely extraordinary. This is one of the few people in the world who was a pioneer in the first jet fighter bomber ever, the Messerschmitt 262. By the time they got these prototype jet fighter bombers, there was no fuel available in Germany. Many a time, you had Messerschmitt 262 sitting on the runway while 1,000 bomber raids were flattening cities, incinerating whole cities like Dresden, and no fuel for the plane to take off. So the technology was there, but they didn't have the aviation fuel. But and that's why they would be couldn't taxi on the runway using their own fuel. It was so needed to conserve, they'd have to tow them. And Steigler became one of those Messerschmitt 262. And here's the elite unit, the Jager 44. All the pilots there had Knight's Crosses. They were the best of the best of the best. And you can see here people of this Jager 44, which included Adolf Garland, who was the head of all the fighters, and one of the greatest fighter aces of all time, and Lutzow. And Garland and Lutzow, absolute legends. What these people choose, and Trauloft, Hohagen, and Steinhoff, who became the chief of the German Air Force after the Second World War, and chief of NATO's air forces. And he was burned alive so badly, most of his body was worse than 3rd-degree burns. He was seriously incinerated, and he survived. A crash landing with a Messerschmitt 262 with aviation fuel all over. I mean, he is slipping and sliding and spilling aviation fuel. He is on fire. He survived, and he went on to rebuild his country's air force for the Cold War fighting, preparing to fight the Soviets. And Major Gert Barkhorn, who became the 2nd greatest fighter air ace of all time. I think he got something like 300 and something air victories, just under Hartmann, who got 360 odd. So these Messerschmitt 262s would come like a bat out of hell on these flying fortresses and shoot them down so fast. Nobody could believe the ability of these, because they had machine cannon, 30mm machine cannon in the nose, and of course the speed they could go at, there was nothing to catch them or stop them. And so if they'd had more fuel, if they'd had these available a bit earlier, the balance of the war would have been pretty different. So these are some of the pictures that have come since of the Jager 44 who tried to turn the war, but it was too late. And there were just too many of these 1,000 bomber raids coming over. But he carved up quite a few of the B-17s, trying to protect the cities as they were coming in. And it's quite a story, the dangers. And of course, they lost a lot of great men. This is such pioneer technology that they were involved in. Well, in January 1990, Brown received a letter. He opened it and read, he had scoured the military archives in the US and England, attended a pilots reunion and shared his story, and he finally placed an ad in a German newsletter to former Luftwaffe pilots retelling his story and asking, does anyone know who this pilot could be? So here's the letter he gets. Dear Charles, all these years I wondered what happened to B-17. Did she make it or not? It was Steigler. He had left Germany after the war. He had moved to Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. 1953, he became a prosperous businessman. Now retired, Steigler told Brown he'd be in Florida the next summer, and sure would be nice to talk about our encounter. And Brown was so excited he couldn't wait to see Steigler. He called directory assistance for Vancouver, asked whether there's a number for Franz Steigler, dialed the number, and Steigler picked it up. And as Brown spoke to him, tears ran down his cheeks. Brown had to do more. He wrote a letter to Steigler in which he said, to say thank you, thank you, thank you on behalf of my surviving crew members and their families appears totally inadequate. The two pilots would meet again, but this time in the lobby of a Florida hotel. And one of their friends recorded the union. You can actually see it on YouTube as well. Both men looked like retired businessmen, plump, sporting neat ties, formal shirts, but they enjoyed the encounter in light, jovial town. And then the mood changed when someone asked Steigler what he thought about Brown. And Steigler sighed and his square jaw tightened and he fought back the tears. And he said in a heavy accent in English, "I love you, Charlie." Now Steigler had lost his brother, his friends and his country. He was virtually exiled by his countrymen after the war who looked at the fighter pilots with disdain. They failed to protect our cities while the bombers tore us apart. And so he found himself stigmatized and hated so much that he moved to Canada because the fighters were considered, you failed us. You did not protect us. Now there were 28,000 fighters who fought for the Luftwaffe. Only 1,200 survived the war. They fought and flew until they were wiped out. And it comes out in this book. The American Air Force were ordered to shoot at any parachuting German pilot. They said, these guys are so good, if they're in a parachute, kill them before they get to ground or they'll be up again and fight again. And so while the Luftwaffe was observing code of you don't shoot pilots in a parachute, the American Air Force had a flat order, you shoot all pilots in a parachute. I never knew that, but that comes out in this book written by an American. Brown and Steigler became friends. They would take fishing trips together, they'd fly cross-country to each other's homes, they took road trips together, they shared their story at schools, veterans reunions, and their wives, Jackie and Hia, who is an Austrian, became friends. Brown's daughter said her father would worry about Steigler's health and constantly check in on him. It wasn't just for show, she said, they really did feel for each other. They talked about once a week. As his friendship with Steigler deepened, something else happened to his father. His daughter said, the nightmares went away. Brown had written a letter of thanks to Steigler, but one day he showed the extent of his gratitude. He organized a reunion of his surviving crew members along with their extended families. He invited Steigler as a guest of honor. And during the reunion, a video was played showing all the faces of the people that now lived, children, grandchildren, relatives, all of which would not exist if Steigler had shot down that bomber that day. And Steigler watched the film from his seat of honor. Everyone was crying, and not just him. I mean, you just think of the consequences. One life. Take it 50, 60, 80 years down the line. How many lives are affected? You just think what was killed in the First World War trenches. And how many lives were saved because of the Christmas truce and acts of kindness and chivalry like that of Franz Steigler. Now, Steigler and Brown died within months of each other, both in 2008. Steigler was 92, Brown was 87. They both could have died in their 20s. They'd started off as enemies, they became friends, and then much more. The author of the book, Makos, discovered what was then by accident after spending a night at Brown's house. He was poking through Brown's library and he came across a book on German fighter jets. Steigler had given the book to Brown because they're both country boys who love to read about planes. Makos opened the book, saw the inscription Steigler had written to Brown. In 1940, I lost my brother as a night fighter. On the 20th of December, 4 days before Christmas, I had the chance to save a B-17 from destruction. A plane so badly damaged, it's a wonder that it was still flying. That pilot, Charlie Brown, is for me as precious as my brother was. Thanks, Charlie, your brother Franz. Isn't it incredible? Over Christmas season, how people's thoughts can change and enemies can suddenly become friends and even brothers. And these are some pictures that were put together in artistic works which they both signed. And of course this book, which really must be made into a film. I mean, this, in fact, it goes through the whole life of both these two men and how they converge. Absolutely extraordinary story. It's such a, I learned more about what it was to be a German fighter pilot and what it was to be an American bomber pilot than anything else. If they had known what would become of their countries, they would not have fought against each other. They would have fought side by side. In fact, I've heard that. Ian Smith said to me, and we met many a time in his last 20 years, tea, lunch, suppers, prayer, Bible reading, radio interviews. And Ian Smith said to me, you know, we would have been better off losing the Second World War. We'd still have Rhodesia, Africa would still be a paradise. Europe would still be Europe, the Soviet Union would have been dead. Or, better still, we should have joined the Germans on the Eastern Front and fought the real enemy, the Soviet Union. That would have saved Africa a lot of grief. Now, that's a Second World War veteran who put 6 years into it. I've heard similar ideas expressed by some veterans of different sides all over the place. That, you know, if we could have seen what would become of our countries, how our politicians would betray us, we would not have fought against each other. We would have rather fought together against the real enemy. Could they have realized, while they were fighting one another, their cousins, that Islam would be allowed to invade Europe by the tens of millions? While your children are learning to tolerate these children are training to kill your children. That's not an exaggeration. For centuries, Christians in Europe fought Islam, fought the Turks, fought to protect Europe, fought to protect Christendom. And now they welcome them in. It's absolutely extraordinary. Now Time celebrates a child-free life. And the new Europeans. Yeah, well, that's clever. Let's sterilize and abort and have a child-free life, and then, oh dear, we need to bring in a replacement population. And, oh, gee, who could have seen that coming? Diversity makes us stronger. Yeah, this is some of the grooming gangs that they've had in England who were allowed for over 25 years to rape and molest 1 million children in Britain without being prosecuted because the police did not want to be called racist. And so these Islamic grooming gangs were allowed to abuse 1 million English children over 2.5 decades without any prosecutor willing to do it. And these are just some of the scandals that came out. Oh, the average European today would rather be raped or stabbed than called a racist. Isn't guilt manipulation great? This is how policemen used to look. This is what they look like now. Diversity is our strength. And this is what a Christmas market looks like in France these days. Yep. Now open stab-proof vests for age 11 to 18 from just under £20. Diversity is our strength. I mean, you know, as my dad said, if we could have seen what would happen to our countries, we wouldn't have fought against one another. The store for modern childhood. No jokes. This is modern childhood. You need to get your child a stab-free vest, stab-proof vest. There are people from Poland all over the world standing up against Islamization. They had a referendum in Switzerland, no more mosques. That's it. No mosques allowed to be built in Switzerland. Can understand. And expel the Islamists. Europe used to produce crusaders. And they said it was God's will to resist. And now Europe hates its Christian heritage, generally, and ignoring the stones crying out about the heritage. So, if these enemies could get along, maybe you can make it through dinner on Christmas with your relatives.
Yeah.
It remains an extraordinary testimony to the power of the gospel that during such a terrible time of world war, soldiers from so many armies on opposite sides could come and stop fighting, come out of their trenches and embrace the enemies in the name of the Prince of Peace. I've got on our table a Christmas truce article I wrote, which contains quite a few of the materials I shared tonight. It's a good chance to put Christ back into Xmas. 'Tis the reason, 'tis the season, 'tis the reason. The crown of the wreath, Christmas wreath and the crown of thorns, I think that puts a balance between Christmas and Easter. Wise men still seek him. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulders. And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. My favorite Christmas verse. Any comments, any questions, anecdotes about the Christmas truce?
Thank you very much.
It's a great season of the year. It's a great time for kindness to strangers and family, neighbors, and you can evangelize and outreach so much easier at Christmas time because there's a whole different spirit around it at the time. It's good to make use of it. Anyone got any comments or questions? What's your favorite Christmas carol? Any suggestions?
Silent Night.
That's what we will end with, Silent Night. Of course, remember that tomorrow is Day of the Covenant. And interesting, I've just been in KwaZulu, and we had everyone there from the royal house of Kingdom of Zululand to the Kingdom of Swaziland, and 10,000 people packing in the auditorium of KwaZulu, celebrating 70 years of the ministry of Erlo Stegen, this wonderful German missionary who the king of the Zulus, King Goodwill Zwelithini, called God's apostle to the Zulu. And, the liberation of the Zulus began on Day of the Covenant. Before 16 December 1838, there was no known baptized Zulu converts. For 20 years, there had been American and other missionaries, Christian missionaries, working among Zulus without a single known convert. So great was the fear of the dictator, Shaka Dingon, and of the witch doctors. No Zulu was known to come to Christ before 1838. So the Day of the Covenant in many ways marks the spiritual liberation of the Zulu nation. There's millions of Zulu Christians today. Some of the most on-fire Christians, and it's a result of they were defeated in war, and the enemies were gracious to them afterwards, did not give evil for evil, but planted missions and churches amongst them, and the Zulus came to Christ in great numbers, and that's quite a story in and of itself.